in the dust-choked plains of the Old West, where survival was measured not in riches but in grit, there lived a cowboy who knew more about hardship than comfort. He was a man who had given his youth to the land, who had endured droughts, storms, and long rides beneath an unforgiving sun. Yet, despite all he had sacrificed, the sharpest wounds did not come from nature's cruelty, but from the scorn of his very own sons. They laughed at his patched boots, mocked his worn-out saddle, and turned their backs on the man who had once carried them on his shoulders. To them, he was nothing but a relic of failure, too poor to command respect, too humble to be seen as a figure of pride. But the story does not rest in the sting of betrayal. For in the shadow of that rejection, a small figure appeared, someone who had no blood ties, no inheritance, and no worldly claim to his name. An orphan, frail in body yet rich in spirit, chose to stand beside the cowboy when everyone else abandoned him. The boy's loyalty was not bought with gold, nor demanded by duty. It was born from recognition, a recognition of dignity, of quiet strength, of the kind of honor that cannot be measured by the weight of a coin purse. And that single act of solidarity would change everything. Imagine the sight: the old cowboy, shoulders bowed by years of toil, suddenly finding in the eyes of a child the respect his own sons had denied him. In that moment, he was no longer just a man mocked for his poverty. He was a figure of resilience, a reminder that true worth is not spoken through titles or wealth, but through the way a heart beats when tested by fire. The orphan's small hand, clutching his weathered arm, became a symbol, a silent defiance against ridicule, a declaration that the cowboy's story was not finished. This tale is not about wealth or failure, nor is it about the easy judgments of those who confuse poverty with weakness. It is about the unexpected alliances that rise from the ashes of rejection, the quiet heroes who step forward when the world turns away. It is about the boy who had nothing yet gave everything, the gift of loyalty, and the man who, for the first time in years, realized he was not truly alone. Together, they began to rewrite a narrative that others had so cruelly defined for them. And as the sun dipped low behind the mesas, casting long shadows across the land, the cowboy's legacy found a new foundation, not in his son's pride, but in the courage of a child who saw in him something greater than failure. This was the beginning of a bond forged not by blood, but by trust, resilience, and unshakable faith. A story of mockery turned into honor, of loneliness transformed into companionship, and of how sometimes the most unlikely voices rise to defend the ones everyone else has abandoned. The cowboy's days were long and silent after his son's cruel words. Each morning he rose before dawn, tightening the same worn belt around his waist, stepping into boots that bore more dust than leather. His sons, now men with ambition in their eyes, had no use for his humble ways. They saw prosperity in railroads, banks, and merchants' ledgers, not in the back-breaking work of tending cattle and mending fences. To them, their father was a symbol of stagnation, a man who had given everything to the land and received nothing but calloused hands and empty pockets in return. Their laughter, sharp and unrelenting, cut deeper than the whip of any outlaw's lash. The orphan watched from the edges of the ranch, always silent, always observing. He had no family name to defend, no inheritance to shield him, and yet he saw in the cowboy a strength that no one else acknowledged. The boy had learned to survive on scraps, had slept beneath cold stars with nothing but hope as a blanket, and it was that same resilience he recognized in the old man. The cowboy's poverty was not shameful. It was evidence of a life lived with endurance. In his silence, the orphan understood what the sons could not, that honor could be carried in cracked boots and dignity could live in a weathered face. One evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon, the sons returned from town, their voices loud with drink and arrogance. They mocked their father once more, calling him a fool who had wasted his life on cattle that barely fed them. The cowboy stood motionless, enduring each word as though he had no fight left in him. But then, from the shadows, the orphan stepped forward. His small voice broke the cruel chorus, sharp with conviction as he defended the man everyone else ridiculed. In that instant, silence fell. No one had expected a child, an outsider, to speak with such fire. The cowboy lifted his head, meeting the boy's eyes. For years he had carried the weight of silence, never fighting back, never answering his son's contempt. But something stirred within him that night. It was not anger, but a kind of rebirth, the slow ignition of a flame long buried under years of disappointment. The orphan's courage reached into the hollow places of his soul and reminded him of who he once was, a rider who had tamed wild mustangs, a fighter who had faced storms, a father who had once believed in legacy. The old man's heart beat stronger, steadier, as though the boy's faith had awakened his own. The ranch, once filled with derision and scorn, now carried a different weight. The orphan's presence shifted the air, exposing the son's cruelty and restoring the cowboy's dignity. And though the night ended with no apologies and no reconciliation, something had undeniably changed. The orphan had become a witness to the cowboy's worth, and that single moment of defiance set the stage for a bond stronger than blood, a bond that would soon be tested by the unforgiving trials of the West. Days passed, and the orphan's loyalty only deepened. He followed the cowboy on long rides across the barren fields, his small legs struggling to keep pace, but never giving up. The boy listened carefully to the cowboy's words, though the old man spoke little. Every gesture, every action, was a lesson. How to spot a storm rolling across the plains. How to mend a fence with nothing but rope and persistence. How to respect a horse's spirit rather than break it. These were lessons the sons had dismissed as useless, but to the orphan, they were treasures worth more than gold. Each moment carved trust between them, slowly reshaping two lonely lives into one shared path. The townsfolk noticed the change. They had once joined in the son's laughter, dismissing the cowboy as a man left behind by progress. But now they saw him differently. With the orphan at his side, there was a quiet strength that could not be ignored. People began to whisper that perhaps the old man was not as broken as he seemed. Perhaps wealth was not measured in coins, but in the respect one inspired in others. The image of the cowboy and the orphan walking side by side, one tall and worn, the other small and determined, carried a symbolism too powerful to be mocked. The sons, however, grew restless. They could not understand how a nameless orphan had replaced them in their father's silent affections. Envy twisted their pride, and pride became bitterness. They sneered at the boy, calling him a beggar who would never amount to anything. Yet every insult they hurled only made the orphan stand firmer beside the cowboy. The child did not need to raise his voice often. His presence alone was enough to challenge their contempt. And deep down, the sons felt a sting they could not admit, that the respect they had withheld was now given freely by a stranger. The cowboy, though weathered and scarred by life, found new strength in this companionship. He worked harder than before, his movements steadier, his spirit calmer. He began to laugh again, a rare sound that carried across the fields like an echo from the past. It was not the laugh of a man who had gained riches, but of one who had found something greater, purpose. And that purpose was no longer bound to sons who rejected him, but to a boy who believed in him without question. The cowboy's life, once defined by shame, was slowly being rewritten by loyalty. Yet beneath the surface, storm clouds were gathering. The bitterness of his sons was not harmless. It festered into something darker. And in the Old West, where disputes were often settled with fists, knives, or bullets, jealousy could quickly turn into danger. The bond between the cowboy and the orphan was strong, but the world around them was unforgiving. It would not be long before both loyalty and love would be tested by fire. The orphan's admiration for the cowboy only grew stronger as days turned into weeks. He saw in the old man's every action a quiet dignity that no wealth could purchase. When the cowboy rode out before sunrise, the boy followed, determined to match his steps even when exhaustion pulled at his small body. He watched the cowboy's hands as they tied knots, as they repaired broken harnesses, as they calmed wild horses with nothing but patience. These hands, worn by decades of hardship, told a story the sons never cared to hear. To the orphan, each callus was proof of sacrifice, each wrinkle a mark of endurance. But shadows of doubt crept into the cowboy's mind when he was alone. He wondered if perhaps his sons had been right, if he truly was nothing but a failure. The land yielded little, the cattle were few, and the world was changing faster than he could keep up. He felt the weight of poverty pressing against him, like the desert heat. Yet whenever those thoughts threatened to consume him, he caught the boy's gaze, steady, unwavering, filled with something he had nearly forgotten: respect. In that gaze, the old man found a reason to keep standing. The townsfolk began to whisper more loudly now. They saw the orphan working beside the cowboy, as though he were born into the family. The boy fetched water, carried tools, and never complained. Many wondered how a child with no blood ties could show more loyalty than sons of his own flesh. The contrast was undeniable. Some praised the boy's courage, while others mocked the cowboy further, suggesting he needed a stray child to defend his pride. But mockery no longer cut as it once did. The orphan's presence had turned humiliation into resilience. The sons, however, could not bear it. Their contempt deepened into jealousy, and jealousy into hatred. Each time they saw the boy riding alongside their father, something inside them twisted. They had spent their lives seeking validation through wealth and power, only to see a nameless orphan win their father's heart with nothing but loyalty. They began a plot, not out loud at first, but with glances and whispers exchanged in shadow. Pride had blinded them so thoroughly that they no longer saw their father as family, but as a man who had betrayed them with affection they no longer deserved. One night, the cowboy sat by the fire, the orphan at his side. The flames danced against the dark sky, and for the first time in years, the old man allowed himself to speak of the past. He told stories of cattle drives across endless plains, of standoffs with outlaws, of storms that nearly swept away the ranch. The orphan listened with wide eyes, drinking in every word. To him, these were not tales of failure, but of survival and courage. That night, under the crackling fire and vast heavens, a bond was sealed more firmly than blood could ever forge. Trouble began when the sons returned from town, with more than just bitterness in their hearts. They carried anger sharpened by whiskey and fueled by humiliation. Word had spread that the old man was no longer alone, that an orphan had taken the place of sons who should have been loyal. Their pride could not endure the shame. They stormed into the ranch one evening, their voices raised, demanding to know why a stranger's loyalty mattered more than their own flesh. The cowboy, weary of conflict, tried to quiet them, but their anger was too fierce to be calmed. The orphan stepped forward again, his small frame trembling yet unyielding. He spoke not with arrogance, but with truth. He reminded the sons that a man's worth was not measured in coins or cattle, but in the integrity of his heart. The words, though spoken by a child, carried the weight of something greater, something eternal. The sons sneered, mocking him as a beggar who dared to lecture men. But behind their ridicule was fear, for the boy's words pierced where their pride was weakest, in the emptiness of their own hearts. The cowboy's silence broke then. For years he had endured their scorn without reply, choosing peace over conflict, patience over anger. But seeing the boy defend him with such courage stirred something fierce within him. His voice, though cracked with age, carried power as he told his sons the truth. That loyalty meant more than blood, that respect could not be demanded but earned, and that the orphan, though small and nameless, had shown more strength than they ever had. The sons fell silent, stunned, for they had never heard their father speak with such fire. The tension in the room was heavy, as if the air itself held its breath. The orphan stood beside the cowboy, his presence unshaken despite the danger that simmered before him. The old man placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of both gratitude and protection. It was the first time he had openly chosen him before his sons, and the declaration was clear. This child was no longer just a wanderer. He was family. The bond was undeniable, and its strength burned brighter than the son's bitter pride. But resentment, once planted, rarely dies quickly. The sons left that night, but their silence was more dangerous than their shouting. Their pride had been wounded, their authority challenged, and their father's loyalty stripped from them. In the unforgiving lands of the West, where justice often rode on the edge of a gun, such bitterness could only lead to storm. The cowboy and the orphan had found each other, but they would soon face trials greater than either had imagined. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. The cowboy sensed the storm brewing, not in the skies above but in the hearts of his own sons. He had lived long enough to know that silence could be more dangerous than shouting. while the ranch carried on with its daily rhythms. Horses to be tended, fences to be mended, water hauled from the well. There was an undercurrent of unease. The orphan noticed it too, though he spoke little of his fear. He simply stayed closer to the cowboy, his small shadow following the old man's every move, as though he knew danger lurked just beyond the horizon. At dusk, the cowboy would often sit by the corral, watching the herd graze against the fading light. The orphan would sit beside him, and though neither spoke much, the bond between them grew deeper in those silences. The boy no longer saw himself as a wanderer without a name, but as part of something larger, part of a story where loyalty and love were more binding than blood. For the cowboy, those quiet evenings brought a peace he had not felt in years, though the unease in his chest warned him that this peace would not last. The townsfolk, always quick to gossip, added fuel to the fire. Some admired the cowboy's newfound strength with the boy at his side, but others sneered, whispering that he had turned against his own flesh and blood. Rumors spread quickly in the Old West, and before long, the story of the orphan who replaced the sons became a tale told in saloons, where whiskey made tongues sharper and tempers shorter. Pride is fragile, and the son's pride, already wounded, was pushed closer to the edge with every whisper they overheard. The sons began to plot openly now. They met in backrooms of taverns, speaking in low tones about their father and the boy who had humiliated them. Some men laughed, dismissing their anger as nothing but drunken talk, but others leaned in, eager to fan the flames. Jealousy is contagious, and it fed the sons' bitterness until it grew into something reckless. Their words carried threats, and though they lacked courage alone, together they convinced themselves that something had to be done. The cowboy, unaware of the details, felt the weight of betrayal before it even reached him. A man who has ridden through storms and outlived enemies develops instincts sharper than steel. He knew his sons were not finished, and though his heart ached at the thought, he also knew one thing with certainty. If danger came, he would not face it alone. The orphan, fragile though he seemed, had become his ally, perhaps the only one willing to stand at his side when the world turned against him. The test came sooner than expected. One night, as the wind howled across the plains, the sons returned, not with words this time, but with fury in their eyes and hands hovering near the holsters of their guns. The orphan was the first to see their approach. His heart raced, but instead of hiding, he ran to the cowboy, tugging at his sleeve and pointing into the dark. The old man rose slowly, his movements calm but deliberate. He knew this night would come, though he had prayed it never would. The sons stormed into the yard, their voices raised with anger and their accusations sharp. They called the orphan a thief of affection, a beggar who had stolen their place. They accused their father of betrayal, of choosing loyalty from a stranger over the duty owed to blood. The orphan stood close to the cowboy, his small frame pressed against the man's side, but his eyes burned with the same fire as before. For all his fear, he would not run. The cowboy, weathered and weary, faced his sons with a strength born not of wealth, but of conviction. His voice cut through their shouting like a blade through silence. He told them that love could not be commanded, that respect was not owed by birthright, and that a man's true sons were not always of his blood, but of his heart. The words struck deep, and for a moment, the sons faltered, unable to match the fire in his tone. But pride, once wounded, can blind a man beyond reason. The eldest son reached for his revolver, his pride boiling over into violence. The air grew heavy, the world narrowing to the slow movement of his hand. Yet before steel cleared leather, the orphan stepped forward, placing himself between the cowboy and the gun. The boy's small voice rang out, trembling yet resolute, begging the sons to see what their father truly was, a man who had given everything, even when it cost him everything. The courage of that moment froze them where they stood. The standoff lingered, fragile as glass, each breath threatening to shatter it. The cowboy's hand rested gently on the boy's shoulder, steadying him, silently thanking him. The son's hands trembled, torn between rage and the undeniable truth spoken by a child. For the first time, they saw their father not through the lens of their pride, but through the loyalty of the orphan who refused to abandon him. And in that moment, though the danger had not yet passed, something shifted in the hearts of all who stood in that yard. The night stretched on, heavy with tension. The sons stood frozen, their hands still hovering near their guns. But the sight of the orphan shielding their father unsettled them in ways they could not explain. How could a child, with no name and no claim, possess the courage they themselves had lost? Their pride told them to push forward, to prove their strength, but somewhere in their hearts a sliver of doubt began to form. For the first time, they wondered if perhaps their father's worth was not as hollow as they had always believed. The cowboy's voice softened, no longer sharp with rebuke, but steady with truth. He spoke of the years he had carried them, the sacrifices he had made, and the dreams he once held for them. He admitted his failures openly, the poverty, the missed opportunities, the hard life that had left him with little to give but his own strength. Yet he reminded them that even in his weakness, he had never abandoned them, never turned his back when they were young and vulnerable. His words, though quiet, struck with the weight of years of unspoken love. The orphan listened closely, his eyes wide as though each word carved itself into his soul. He saw the cowboy not just as a figure of survival, but as a man of truth, unafraid to admit his scars. To the boy, these were not failures but testaments of endurance, proof that greatness did not always roar with glory but endured in silence. And, as the cowboy spoke, the boy's hand tightened into a fist, ready to defend him if needed, ready to stand by him, even if the sons chose violence. The eldest son lowered his hand first, though his eyes still burned with bitterness. He muttered something about weakness, but his voice cracked under the weight of his own uncertainty. The younger son followed, torn between loyalty to his brother and the undeniable pull of his father's words. Neither could bring themselves to draw steel against the man who had given them life, though the shame of standing down twisted like a knife in their pride. The orphan's courage had shifted the course of the night, but the danger was not gone. The sons turned away, retreating into the darkness, their silence more threatening than any shouted word. The cowboy exhaled slowly, the tension loosening from his shoulders, but he knew this was only a pause in the storm. Pride had not been broken. It had merely stepped aside, waiting for another moment to rise. The following days carried a strange stillness. The ranch seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself knew that something had been set in motion. The cowboy carried on with his work, his movements slower now, weighed by the knowledge that his own blood had nearly raised steel against him. Yet beside him, the orphan's presence steadied his steps. The boy rose earlier, worked harder, and matched the old man's pace with a determination that no child his age should possess. He was no longer just a helper. He had become the cowboy's strength. Word of the standoff spread through town like wildfire. Men in the saloon spoke in hushed voices, marveling at the courage of the orphan who had faced down grown men. Some laughed at the sons, calling them cowards for hesitating before a child, while others whispered that such defiance would only end in blood. Either way, the story traveled, and with each retelling, the image of the cowboy began to change. No longer just a poor relic of the past, he was now the man who had stood unbroken with a boy at his side. The orphan, though young, began to feel the weight of those whispers. Strangers looked at him with awe, some with admiration, others with pity. But he did not seek their approval. His loyalty was not for the town or its gossip. It was for the cowboy alone. Each day he reminded himself that family was not built by name or by wealth, but by the choice to stay when others walked away. That choice had been made, and he would not falter. The sons, meanwhile, stewed in their bitterness. They heard the same whispers, but to them it was humiliation. They had set out to destroy their father's dignity, only to find themselves mocked in taverns and ridiculed by neighbors. Their pride, already fragile, now burned with the desire for vengeance. And though they had hesitated once, shame pushed them toward a dangerous resolve. They would not allow themselves to be remembered as the sons undone by a beggar boy. The cowboy sensed the coming storm, but did not speak of it to the orphan. Instead, he taught him more: how to ride with balance, how to fire a rifle with steady aim, how to hold his ground when fear tried to take him. These were lessons not given out of hope for violence, but out of necessity. For in the Old West, survival demanded readiness, and the cowboy knew the day would come when loyalty would no longer be tested with words, but with fire and steel. The sun rose over the plains with an eerie stillness, casting long shadows across the ranch. The cowboy awoke with a heaviness in his chest, a sense that the quiet was not peace, but warning. He saddled his horse slowly, every movement deliberate, while the orphan busied himself at the morning chores. Yet even the boy felt it. The land seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The West was like that. It spoke in silence, warning those who had ears to listen. The cowboy took the orphan out riding that morning, further than usual, into the open fields where the horizon stretched without end. As they rode, he began to teach lessons he had never taught his own sons. He showed the boy how to read the wind in the grass, how to track cattle by their prints, how to steady his aim not just with his hands but with his heart. The orphan listened intently, absorbing each word as though it were scripture. These were not just skills of survival. They were legacies, the kind a father leaves to his son. That afternoon, as the sun burned hot above them, they stopped by the river. The cowboy dismounted and sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree. For the first time, he spoke not of survival but of belonging. He told the boy that family was not measured in bloodlines, but in who stands with you when the world turns its back. The orphan's eyes welled with tears, for he had longed to hear words like that his entire life. In that moment, beneath the whisper of the river, the cowboy gave the boy what he had never been given before, a name that carried weight. He called him son. The boy's small voice cracked as he swore he would never leave the cowboy's side. It was a vow, unshakable as the mountains, spoken not with the arrogance of youth, but with the sincerity of a child who had found the only place he truly belonged. The cowboy rested a hand on his shoulder, his eyes filled with something rare, hope. For the first time in many years, he believed that perhaps his story was not one of failure, but of redemption. But as they rode back toward the ranch, their peace was shattered. From the distance, they saw riders approaching, dust rising like a storm behind them. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He knew the shapes of those riders. He knew the rhythm of their horses. His sons had returned, not with words, but with men at their side. And this time, the weight of their pride carried the smell of blood. The riders drew closer, their figures sharp against the fading light of dusk. The sons had not come alone. They brought with them men from the saloon, drifters and outlaws eager for a share of whatever vengeance the brothers promised. The sound of hooves thundered like a drumbeat of war, each strike shaking the earth beneath the cowboy and the orphan. The boy's breath quickened, but he did not turn away. He tightened his grip on the reins, his small hands trembling yet determined. The cowboy dismounted slowly, placing himself between the orphan and the advancing riders. His eyes, weathered by decades of hardship, burned with a quiet fire. He had faced storms, wolves, and outlaws, but this was different. These were his own sons, men born of his blood, riding against him as though he were an enemy. The pain of that truth cut deeper than any blade, but he stood firm. He had been mocked, ridiculed, abandoned, but he would not be broken. The eldest son rode forward, his face twisted with anger, shouting accusations that echoed across the land. He called his father a traitor, a coward, a man who had chosen a beggar over his own flesh. His words, sharpened by years of resentment, struck hard. Yet as he raged, the orphan stepped out from behind the cowboy, his small voice steady and clear. He told them that honor was not something inherited but earned, and that the cowboy had given him more than they ever had, a family. The outlaws laughed at the boy's defiance, but the words pierced the sons deeper than bullets. For in that moment, the truth stood naked before them. Their father's poverty had not robbed him of greatness. It had revealed it. And this orphan, with nothing but courage in his chest, had seen it all along. Pride battled with shame in their eyes, and the silence that followed was heavier than any insult. The cowboy stood tall, his hand resting gently on the orphan's shoulder, as if to say that no matter what storm came, they would face it together. The riders shifted uneasily, caught between pride and respect, vengeance and truth. The sun dipped low, casting fire across the horizon, as if the heavens themselves were watching. And in that moment, the fate of the cowboy, his sons, and the orphan hung in the balance, ready to be written by loyalty, pride, and the unforgiving hand of the Old West. The dust of the confrontation eventually settled, but the lesson carved into the land remained. The cowboy, once mocked by his own blood, had found redemption not through wealth or power, but through the loyalty of a child who chose to stand beside him when no one else would. In that loyalty, the world saw a truth greater than any inheritance. That family is not always forged by birth, but by the courage to stay when others walk away. The sons, scarred by pride, were forced to confront a reality they had long denied. Their father's worth was not measured in coins or cattle, but in the resilience of his spirit. They had turned away from him in search of status, only to find themselves overshadowed by the courage of a nameless orphan. It was not shame that broke them, but the realization that they had abandoned what truly mattered. Pride had been their master, and in serving it, they had lost sight of their father's heart. The orphan, once invisible to the world, had become the living proof that greatness can be recognized by those with nothing to gain. His loyalty gave the cowboy back his dignity, and his courage reminded everyone that true strength does not always roar with weapons, but often whispers in the steady choice to stand firm. In the barren lands of the West, where survival often seemed cruel, the bond between the old man and the boy shone as a light no darkness could extinguish. This story, though born of the Old West, carries a truth that crosses time. Honor cannot be bought, love cannot be demanded, and respect cannot be forced. They are earned in silence, in sacrifice, in the quiet moments where one's soul chooses another. And when such choices are made, they echo louder than any gunshot, leaving a legacy stronger than wealth and deeper than pride. If this story moved you, let it be more than just a tale you watched. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part spoke to your heart most deeply? Leave a like to keep stories like this alive, and subscribe so you never miss the next journey through the emotional heart of the Old West. Because here, every tale is more than history. It is a mirror, reflecting truths we still carry today.